Hello, and welcome to Stoicism Philosophy as a Way of Life. My name is Donald Robertson, and today's guest is Igor Grossmann, a professor of psychology and renowned researcher in the field of wisdom. Professor Grossmann directs the Wisdom and Culture Lab at the University of Waterloo, where he investigates the factors that contribute to wise reasoning. He's also the co-host of the On Wisdom podcast. His work has significantly advanced our understanding of how wisdom can be fostered and applied to everyday life. So, hello and welcome to the podcast.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure to speak to you. I'm fascinated by the research that you do. I guess I just wanted to launch straight in, if you don't mind, and ask you the obvious big question. What is wisdom?
Oh boy, that's a big one.
That's a big one. And at the deep end.
And well, obviously, I mean, that's the wise thing to say. And it really depends on the person, because I think every person has some kind of an idea on intuition of what wisdom may be, often sort of linked to either the people they admire or their grandma or somebody else whom they go to for advice or something else. So, I mean, there are a lot of different perspectives. And so what we often do in psychology, we try to figure out if those type of lay perspectives are overlapping with some kind of philosophical and expert-driven foundation. And that's tricky. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes they do not overlap.
I wanted to say, actually, that I think we seldom ask ourselves explicitly what wisdom is, but I think it's actually a pretty good question. I ask my daughter sometimes, she's 13 years old, what does she say wisdom is. She has to think about it a little bit. You know, it takes a bit of kind of coaxing to get an answer. But I find she, and also some other people, will sometimes articulate it in terms of knowing the difference between what's good and bad in life, like understanding what's understanding what's important.
Right.
So,
but it's tricky. It's tricky. Yeah. I mean, how do you figure out how to know, right? And so, the focus is it about what you know, or is it about how you handle complex situations where you have multiple possible solutions or multiple ways to go, and you are essentially at the crossroad? We often are at the crossroad. We have, often multiple ways we can solve an issue, or try to solve an issue. And my gut feeling is that, and this is not more really of a gut feeling instead of sort of a verified claim, is that across many philosophical traditions, as well as human intuitions in various cultures, this notion of, how do you navigate the crossroads is what's really central to the construct. I mean, it doesn't matter if you pick Stoicism, doesn't matter if you pick Buddhism or other forms of philosophical inquiry, or if you just think really hard about how do you the people that you admire, that you attribute some wisdom to solve issues in their lives, or what kind of wisdom are they known for? It's often because you admire how they handled complex situations where they could do things very, very differently.
Yeah. I think we see a trace of this kind of, maybe there are two competing ways of understanding wisdom. In ancient philosophy, I think the philosophers that preceded Socrates, the natural philosophers who are kind of precursors of modern scientists, I think they viewed wisdom more in terms of the content of their doctrines or beliefs. And Socrates, I think, was one of the first people to really emphasize the idea that perhaps wisdom was more of a dynamic process.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably right. I mean, you're more of an expert on this than I am. My gut feeling, sort of, if I put a cultural researcher hat on, is that we know relatively less about works before Socrates. I mean, we don't know much about Socrates by himself either. It was all sort of narrated by Plato and others. But if you go further back, it gets murkier, right? So I mean, we can sort of extrapolate, but it's hard, of course, to make a super definite claims. But you're probably right that it was that certain period, the Platonic period, and thereafter, that had more of a focus on the how versus the
Yeah.
concrete suggestions for what you should do.
So do you think that people today are more inclined to view wisdom as a dynamic process, or do you think there's still a tendency for people in the modern world to think of wisdom as a sort of collection of knowledge, or
That's a very good question. I think it depends on whom you ask. I mean, there's a general issue with whether it's really a modern world. If you look outside and sort of look at the news, or it depends on where you look at the news, and you think, well, is this really that different? Are we really advancing? Sometimes I have my doubts. But I guess to answer your question concretely, I do think that both positions are prevalent, whether it is in decision sciences or in self-help books or in some contemplative philosophical traditions. For instance, in decision sciences, the most popular position is about the value and limitations of so-called heuristics or rules of thumb, which are sort of generalized pieces of knowledge that you could apply in many circumstances. Sometimes they work and many times they don't, but overall they may work because the limited temporal resources. So if you don't have enough energy, this is the right way to do. And so you just pursue that right way that sometimes will work, most of the times will work, and sometimes will not work. And one could certainly try to attempt to think of wisdom in terms of the collection of these heuristics, rules of thumb. And I mean, the many self-help books, like Decision Sciences, would probably advocate for this position. But at the same time, if you look deeper, you will see a whole range of suggestions for how to navigate various complex situations, how to sort of manage your time, how to reflect on yourself differently, how to sort of like be more aware of your thought processes and where they lead you, and sort of then inquire whether this is the right thing to do, whether this is the right strategy or that is the right strategy. And in many ways, this so-called metacognitive process is common. And what's interesting is that it's not only common in the self-help books, but it's also prevalent in the classic philosophical scholarship, and it is central to the modern scientific understanding of wisdom.
something you said a moment ago also prompted another question in my mind, which is, I don't know whether you could answer this very easily or not, but do you feel like our society is any wiser than the ancient world? Let's say if we compare educated people today to people of ancient Greece and Rome, what's your sense of the progress? Like, are we moving forward in terms of technology? Are we making progress in terms of wisdom?
I mean, it's a hard question, and it's intimately connected to what is our benchmark to evaluate what do we desire, what do we aspire to be as a society, and is our aspiration accomplished in some ways, and can we even have the perspective of on what is about to come that we haven't accomplished yet? It's really hard to look at things from the perspective of here now on what we may not even have an understanding what could be possible. So right now everybody screams democracy. Understanding of what democracy means is obviously very, very different from understanding what democracy meant in ancient Greece. I mean, who arguably invented the term. And, they had slaves. Aristotle had no problems with slaves, and arguably was a pretty important philosopher. And yet they had democracy. So, and now, looking back from being aware of that, it's really hard to qualitatively and quantitatively evaluate progress.
Let me ask you
At
a
the same
specific.
time, I mean, but I want to finish. I want to say that there are some markers, of course, along which we could say, like, if sort of the progress um, is about how long people live on average, or how many people get killed in wars. Maybe there is some evidence that we made some progress in this regard, but it's also very narrow markers. And it's also not a given that just living longer that would lead to what Aristotle would have described as eudaimonia.
Let me throw something out that's a bit speculative, but I think it might be an interesting way of looking at things. So we typically think of our society as making progress in terms of technology and science and so on. But
Mm-hmm.
one area where ancient thinkers in Greece and Rome were particularly advanced, which is somewhat neglected today, I think, is in their understanding of rhetoric. They have surprisingly sophisticated texts about the many different ways that language can be used to influence audiences and listeners. So most educated ancient Greeks and Romans had a pretty sophisticated understanding of persuasion skills, verbal rhetoric.
Right.
And they see that as kind of the flip side of logic. You need to understand how language can be used to manipulate us in order to avoid being manipulated by other people. And I wonder if that's a sense in which perhaps our ability to reason independently and avoid being duped or falling into fallacies might be less sophisticated than a typical educated Greek or Roman.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I don't know how to even attempt to evaluate it properly, because we would need to have some kind of an independent benchmark of that.
How
And
would we
as you
measure it?
pointed out, the
Yeah.
rhetoric and the quality of the rhetoric, and if you just look, for instance, at texts that were produced thousands of years ago and compare them to texts, or, I don't know, scripts from TikTok videos, I guess, that are produced now, it's not like that those texts have meaning in their own right. I mean, they're always embedded in a particular cultural understanding of a particular society. And I don't want to make it completely relativist, but it makes it really, really hard to evaluate, because we don't know what kind of metacognitive processes get activated among the listeners and the audience of the TikTok videos. They may be fairly complicated. I mean, the switching, the type of, metaphors that are often applied could be very complicated and sophisticated, where even my generation feels like, oh, we're kind of not getting it. I say, it's too fast. But it's different, right? So that makes it tricky. For instance, what you're mentioning about the complexity and sophistication also reminds me of the sort of Shakespearean era in the English-speaking countries, which was also fairly sophisticated. And you can sort of certainly lament whether we sort of lost that sophistication. The question is, what did we gain in return? And is it really just diminishing of the cognitive or metacognitive abilities, or adapting them to a different techno-ecological reality that we are facing today? Very hard to, of course, quantify,
Hard to
because
quantify.
it means different things.
Yeah. Let me ask you about an aspect of wisdom then that I think research has attempted to quantify, in terms of the
Okay.
dynamic process, which is the relationship between abstract versus concrete thinking in reasoning. Can you speak a little bit about the relationship between wisdom and abstract versus concrete styles of thinking?
Right. So this is very interesting because in many ways, there is this temptation, certainly among those people who are like you and me, maybe clinically inclined, to sort of have some kind of clinical background or have read some about some clinical work. In my case, I don't really have a clinical background, but there's this temptation to think that if you take a big picture, a step back, and focus on this big picture, on the abstract, that's what would lead to wisdom. And I have thought like that for a very long time. I've published multiple papers on that, and the idea behind it is the following one. So you basically, when you are in the heat of the moment, when you are dealing with something really, really difficult, then you feel like you're stuck and you're sort of immersing yourself in that experience. And you don't see anything outside of it. So obviously it's natural, almost trivial to say that, wait, take a step back, focus on the big picture. I mean, good luck doing that in that moment, because if you're really in the heat of the moment, you probably will not be able to, without sufficient training, to really get unstuck, so to say. But I thought for a long time, that's certainly one way to go, and I've conducted a range of studies looking at that how sort of if you distance yourself from the experience or try to uh, instantiate some form of distancing from the self, that it could promote it. And then I realized at some point that I was probably wrong in generalizing from the universal value of abstraction as an element that will promote wisdom or sort of this kind of richer metacognitive processing. And the reason is the following one: when you think about any of the features of metacognition that in philosophy or in psychology are typically associated with wisdom, and we'll talk about some of them later. But just to give one example, this recognition of limits of your knowledge is also like a Socratic wisdom, where Socrates is proclaimed to be the wisest person by the Oracle of Delphi, and then he's like, "Well, I'm not wise at all. Let me check." And so he goes around and starts asking other people how much do they know, because he clearly claims, I don't know anything. I really don't. I have my limits, but you claim you know something. So let me check. And that upsets a lot of people and so on and so forth, right? So that's the story that is often, in a trivialized form, retold in philosophy books. And Socrates is this example of so-called intellectual humility, recognizing limits of your knowledge, because he realizes his fallibility, he realizes limits of his knowledge. And if you take this feature seriously, if you think about that this form of intellectual humility is important for wisdom, well, can you really just get it when you are focusing on the big picture? Probably not. And the reason is because you also need to consider, well, wait a second, what is the situation about? You have to focus on the concrete. And so it's the interplay. So for many features that we associate with wisdom, or with sort of like processing of information in a way that helps you regulate your emotions, regulate your thoughts, be it in psychotherapy, be it in the decision sciences, you kind of have to pay attention to both. And so the interesting thing is, and by both I mean abstractness and concreteness, so focus both on the big picture and focus on the specific details and have this kind of interplay back and forth between them. And so we've done some work recently and tried to look at that indeed was the case, that people who reported higher intellectual humility or more open-minded or more sort of likely to consider different viewpoints, that when they do that, they often focus both on the broader goals, bigger picture, and the specifics of the situation. And in fact, those who are switching, report switching back and forth, we've done some studies on that as well, are more likely to report these features of wisdom. So that's one element. I mean, it's also humbling for me because for a long time I thought, it's all about the big picture. And then I realized that's not the case. And guess what? So the interesting thing is also we kind of knew that in some domains of psychology. For instance, there's this work on forecasting. Who is better able to predict geopolitical events? For instance, will Israel attack Iran or not by tomorrow in retaliation of the attacks? Or will Putin give up his aspirations for Ukraine by this or that day. And so you can sort of like make predictions, make bets. And so there are this people who constantly play these games, almost like fantasy football, where they would be logging into one of the websites where they would be putting bets on for different predictions about geopolitical events. And then some smart scholars try to look who is more likely to be accurate and what is their thinking style. And it turns out that for those people who are more likely to be accurate on average, like across a large number of this type of predictions, they were more likely to kind of play back and forth between abstractness and concreteness in their heads.
Yeah, interesting. I think we'll come back to this actually in relation to some clinical stuff about rumination. But before we do that, I wanted to just kind of broaden out the definition of wisdom that you've been researching, because you mentioned intellectual humility, all right? So immediately, as you've already noted, that's going to make us think of Socrates, right? For a number of reasons. Socrates explicitly says that his philosophy or his method, the Socratic method, is meant as a kind of therapy or a cure for something that he described as intellectual conceit or arrogance, which is also another sense in which he seems to be placing value on developing a kind of intellectual humility. But you also defined wisdom, from what I understand, in terms of three other factors: the open-mindedness, perspective taking, and compromise seeking, you sometimes call them. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think of the features. Look, so yeah, you're absolutely right. So there's intellectual humility. One could talk about open-mindedness to different sort of ways how things go. One could consider different viewpoints. One could try to balance and somehow integrate different interests and perspectives, something that we commonly describe as compromise. These are just features of the broader theme, though. And the broad theme is metacognition.
Okay.
The broad theme is to figure out how can you monitor your thoughts,
Right.
how can you plan better, and in your head, specifically for those situations where you have multiple competing ways you can go. And in order to really get a better picture about those, you need this sort of set of metacognitive processes. So I don't think that, these are the key ingredients. These are example ingredients that we often encounter when we look at how people reflect, and that are potentially easier to measure. But to be honest, there's probably a whole range of others. And they are all part of the same family, namely the family of this type of metacognition that allows you to go beyond your impulsive thoughts that may be coming to you, and you just act on them immediately.
That's fascinating. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but there's a cutting edge style of cognitive behavioral therapy known as metacognitive therapy that specifically targets certain types of metacognition that have been.
I actually have a question about that. What do you think? Like metacognitive therapy, is that really that different from CBT? I mean, or is this just like they're taking the elements from the cognitive behavioral therapy, which is also so metacognitive in my view, and then just put them in the brand of here's a new therapy?
Well, I mean, gosh, it's actually a kind of controversy in some ways. Whenever there's any variation of something established, like within CBT, there's often debate about whether a new style of cognitive therapy or behavior therapy is part of CBT and falls under that umbrella, or whether it's a different thing. Actually, when I saw Adrian Wells, the guy who developed metacognitive therapy, speaking about it at the CBT conference in the UK, he mentioned the fact that he might not be back again in the future because he was seen as having broken away from the orthodoxy of cognitive therapy.
Orthodoxy.
But cognitive, I suppose the difference in practice is that metacognitive therapy has a much narrower scope.
I see.
Traditional cognitive therapy will look at more at the content of clients' beliefs about events, about themselves, and so on. Whereas metacognitive therapy places more emphasis on their style of thinking, whether it's ruminative or not, for example, and the beliefs that they have about their own thoughts and beliefs. So, for instance, someone who's prone to worrying, they might worry about 101 different things. They might worry about their health, about their finances. So rather than looking at the content of the things that they're worrying about, like, for example, are they mistaken about the financial risks that they face, or the severity of the consequences and so on, we might look at how much time they spend ruminating or worrying about these things, whether they're really immersed in those thoughts or they remain detached from them, and beliefs such as whether they think that worrying is helpful, or whether they think worrying is dangerous, whether they think their worrying is uncontrollable. So these are kind of classed as metacognitive beliefs because they relate to the nature of other thought processes.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, like, also even the definition of what is a part of metacognition, and like whether it focuses on beliefs, on regulation of your thought patterns, or emotional reactions. Like the concept of cognitive reappraisal that is so central to, I would say, CBT, and is sort of now its own very sizable body of basic science research. Is in many ways nothing else than those metacognitive processes I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
It's about, taking different perspectives, recognizing that this sort of unfolds and changes, tries to, check whether you're accurate or not.
Absolutely. I mean, some of the processes that you've mentioned are kind of integral to almost all forms of cognitive behavioral therapy. I mean, in particular, for example, the ability to generate alternative perspectives is widely seen as kind of integral to any type of cognitive therapy. That kind of leads me on to another question, actually. Maybe will take us down the clinical road again, which is, obviously you've got a lot to say about the nature of wisdom. I wonder, conversely, like, what do you have any thoughts about how we end up reasoning unwisely? Like, what leads us to lack some of the characteristics that help us to reason wisely?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, I don't know. Now we'll put some kind of a Freudian hat on. It's just say defensiveness. When it's about you, you kind of get defensive quite often. Yeah. So I mean, I certainly. I mean, that's based on some of my and others' empirical work, where in situations where it's about you, you're much more likely to just have a knee-jerk reaction. Your partner comes to you and tells you that, I cheated on you with our friend, and good luck starting to sort of recognizing limits of your knowledge and consider different viewpoints and perspectives in that moment. But when it concerns your friend, you have no problems with that.
Yes.
So it's like, so we have capacities.
That leads into one of the parts of your research that I was particularly drawn to, which is this idea about distance reflection, and actually, we're getting into the topic of, can you change, someone's capacity for wisdom by training them in certain skills, such as third person or Iliism, and use of language. So, to what extent do you think learning to, what does it mean to engage in distanced reflection? How do you train someone to do that? And to what extent can it help them to reason more wisely?
Those are the $1 million questions. How
Yeah.
can you train somebody to be wiser?
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
so we have some baby steps in that direction, and I
Uh-huh.
would say, there are a lot of suggestions. I mean, like some of them, for instance, go back to journaling. That again
Yeah.
is popularized in self-help books, but
Uh-huh.
go back to Stoicism and many contemplative practices where you just keep a diary and
Uh-huh.
ask yourself certain questions in a particular way.
Yeah.
So, like, kind of a little bit inspired by that
Uh-huh.
strategy and a little bit inspired by my experimental work on self-other differences, where we
Okay,
saw
can we
that.
pick that apart a little bit? Can we dive a little bit
Right.
deeper into that? Because so I'll put it out there.
Sure.
I think journaling sometimes could be counterproductive.
Of course.
Right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So
Exactly.
what would be the difference between good and bad? So I'll give you an obvious example from the kind of
Yeah.
clinical point of view, right? And this is part of the impetus, I think, for an evolution in the way that we do CBT. There's CBT changed about 20 years ago. There was what was called the emerging third wave, which emphasized metacognition a lot more,
Okay.
mindfulness, emotional acceptance, and stuff like that. And one of the reasons for that is, like, in the earlier forms of cognitive therapy, we would get clients to keep a record of their automatic thoughts, and we'd give them other kind of written homework exercises. And that works pretty well, except that there's certain clients who, because of their personality, are prone to rumination. And they'll basically, to caricature it a little bit, they'll bring into the next session a huge wad of notes that they've written about their worries and anxiety. So it's clearly not that helpful to them. It's become symptomatic, actually.
Yeah.
They're just using the writing exercise as a way of continuing their rumination. And so, yeah, I guess the idea is that, some people are much more prone to that than others. And keeping a journal, for instance, might be beneficial or not, depending on how someone approaches doing it and the type of things, perhaps, that they write, the way that they write things down. There are many different ways that someone could choose to approach journaling. Some people keep quite concise notes, whereas other people sprawl over pages and pages. Some people might be expressing their feelings and kind of venting in a journal, whereas other people might be attempting to frame things more objectively.
Yeah. I mean, so look, so journaling or writing some things down. Let's take a step back. It's a tool, and as any tool that we have had in the history of humanity, you have to realize that it's a tool. It's not part of you. It's not just an extension of you, because otherwise you'll just keep on using it as if it's you. Now that can be counterproductive. And B, it's all about how you use it. So if you just keep the journal to just extend and it becomes your second nature, I don't think it can work, because you will just continue, as you already pointed out, ruminating on the journal pages. It's about, I think, when it becomes helpful, it's when it's a tool for reframing or for guiding your metacognitive processes. The tricky thing, of course, is, and this is like going back to the studies, in the work that we have done, we try to use exactly that approach, and then try to, okay, if I ask you to either keep a journal in how you would normally do, right, in the first person, describe the most significant things of the day as you would typically do. Okay, I felt this, I experienced this, or take a sort of a metacognitive exercise and take a step back and look at it from a different vantage point. And we did that specifically to have sort of very clean clean experimental condition, where we would ask people to do it from a third person perspective using their name. And that's where this idea of Iliism, talking about yourself or writing about yourself in the third person, comes in. And so that's what we did. But I mean, the interesting thing is, if you take this notion of tool use and habitual tool use versus deliberate, intentional tool use seriously, and of course, over time, any exercise, any instruction, for instance, I can tell you, you know, you should write about yourself in the third person and keep a diary, and then you'll get wiser. And maybe that will be true for the first few sessions, but
Uh-huh.
over time, will
Uh-huh.
it really keep those benefits after a month? I don't know. We haven't done that work. The longest that has ever been done in our lab is a month.
Yeah.
And whether people retain this thereafter and how long they retain it, we still don't know. There's so little empirical evidence on this, despite the fact that, as you
Yeah.
said, journaling is popular, and it's kind of all put together into one large thing, irrespective of how you use journaling.
I think, I mean, what I'm tempted to say as well is what we often find, and this kind of harks back to something you said, I think, about the nature of wisdom itself, that almost any type of good advice that you give people can become bad advice in a different situation, right? So
Right?
coping strategies or self-help techniques that seem to work at first, um, people can misuse them, become overly dependent on them, apply them
Yeah.
too rigidly, or apply them in situations where they're not appropriate anymore. I mean, like, for example, someone might say they think it's really good advice to speak your mind, and that's a good philosophy to have. But in some situations, that'd be terrible advice,
Yeah,
right?
and that's exactly right. And so the issue here is that you could have these rules or rules of thumb, as I would call them, the
Yeah,
heuristics that you would
yeah,
use that may work very well in some situations, but not so well in others. So may
uh,
work very well for some period of time and then stop. And
yeah,
then you say, all right, well, I will find a way to metacognitively adjust. But then
uh-huh,
this metacognitive adjustment may become a rule of thumb in its own right. And so what do you
uh-huh,
do then? Well, I think that's the danger when you just habitually just rely on things
uh-huh.
without intentionally reflecting on their use.
There's a
That's
piece of
when it can backfire.
I don't know if you've heard also, well, now we're getting kind of deep into slightly more technical stuff than I planned, but there's a type of modern cognitive behavioral therapy. We talked about metacognitive therapy. There's a form of behavior therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy, or
Yeah,
ACT. And it's based on a theory in behavioral psychology called relational frame theory.
yeah,
And one of the pieces of research that they tend to reference, cut a long story short, seems to demonstrate that when people are taught verbal rules to follow versus when they discover a strategy through trial and error themselves, they're more likely to over apply the rule in situations where it's no longer productive. So the idea
wait, in
that
which case? In the case of a try and error, or in the case of
in the case of having learned it verbally, so if I
uh-huh,
tell you it's a good idea, the experiment they use is where there are two groups, and one group is asked to solve a puzzle, like they have to press buttons in a certain order to get a reward or something like that. And if
uh-huh,
they're told, they're given verbal guidance on how to solve the puzzle, and then the rules change so that that solution no longer works, they'll carry on trying it like persistently, even though it's not working anymore. Whereas the group that figured it out themselves through trial and error are more likely to adapt. They're more sensitive to changes in their environment. And so this kind of, I think, links to the idea, maybe it helps to answer the question of why would some people over apply uh, uh, a strategy or a rule
yeah,
when it no longer seems to be adaptive to the situation that they find themselves in. This is very important from a therapy point of view, because often the strategies people have or the rules that they follow um, are not completely crazy. Like
yeah,
someone might believe that, for example, that it's important for them to practice. I mean, even a modern therapy technique like mindfulness, someone
yeah,
might believe that it's really important for them to retain mindfulness. But that might backfire in some situations, like in a social speaking situation, public speaking, it
yeah,
might increase their self
right,
consciousness. right? Um, so the difference is that some people carry on doing that rigidly, maybe because they've learned it verbally. Like, whereas if they've kind of figured out these strategies more from trial and error, they may be more open to adapting them when they don't seem to be working as well anymore.
Right. I would generalize here. I would say, I mean, and that may be wrong, given what we talk about here, but I would say it's not just about verbal,
Yeah.
but it is about explicit, essentially didactic instructions,
Yeah.
which what this verbal uh, approach is, right? So it's like you could be verbalized, it could be just memorized, could be a story that you learn from somewhere, and because it doesn't really sample from a whole range of experiences as you
Right.
would with trial and error, it is very hard then to see to have a more flexible way to adopt the strategy
Yeah.
because you would have learned under what circumstances it may or may not have worked.
I'm just going to kind of riff on that for a minute because I can't help but point out, in ancient philosophy, I feel like they're quite aware of some of these, particularly Socrates, but also some of the other ancient, so even some of the Stoics. The debate they have is around the value of what they call moral precepts, right? And so
Uh-huh.
some of the Stoics, Seneca thought moral precepts were really useful, like simple pieces of moral guidance that people could follow. Like advice about how to run a business, or advice how to marry appropriately, or advice
Yeah.
about how to raise your children. A bit
So,
like,
but let me, yeah, but let me ask you this: so that,
yeah.
like, how would then Seneca have reacted to you saying, well, this is a nice journal rule, but in my situation, it doesn't work? What would be his response?
Well, that's a good question. But there were other Stoics. There was a Stoic called Aristotle that said that precepts were useless because
Okay.
he thought if you're wise, then you'll use precepts wisely. But if you're foolish, you'll misapply them, like,
Yeah.
and use them rigidly or over apply them. Like, so Aristotle thought wisdom is more like a skill. Like,
Right.
and there's a risk in becoming overly dependent on these kind of rules of thumb, as you put
Yeah.
them.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, and that's exactly, I mean, why I emphasize these metacognitive skills instead of um, some kind of pieces of knowledge of these presets. By the way, I mean, if you
Yeah.
want to, get into a time machine and travel 2,000 years into the future, and you end up in somewhere in, oh, we're hearing this, right?
Oh, it's not that loud. I thought it was going to be a lot louder. I'm disappointed. That's the fire alarm going off in the background.
Okay,
Uh,
so what do you want to do now?
will we pause for? Let's just pause for a minute until it
Let's see
stops.
how long it is.
Yeah,
Okay,
I don't
then
think
I'll,
it's
I'll
going to
tell
go
you.
very long. And then you tell me if we were to go into the future. You were saying,
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about roles.
I think this. I think they stopped. Okay, so we had a slight interruption there because of the fire alarm.
Fire
And
alarm, yes. Doesn't let us. Uh, so I was just thinking, like, like, okay, so you have Stoics that may contradict each other, and potentially Aristotle, who says, you should be focusing on this kind of adjudicating virtue, wisdom as a meta virtue, or as I would call it, metacognition. But
yeah,
like I recently realized that if you, for instance, look, like fast forward to the future, and you end up in somewhere in upstate New York in Ithaca and meet John Rawls in the 1970s, who's a famous philosopher, moral philosopher in the US at that time. Some of the ideas that he talks about are very, very similar. So Rawls talks
yeah,
about this reflective equilibrium, where you have this
absolutely.
kind of general standard, and then you have specific situation,
Yes.
and you need to really figure out if this general standard applies in this situation or does not apply in this
Yeah.
situation.
Are you
Well, how
suggesting
to
that?
do that?
Philosophers keep reinventing the same?
Well, I mean, it's not different. It's
This is
not the
like-
same thing. I mean, I don't think Aristotle talked about the veil of ignorance, for
no,
instance. So that
I don't.
that's
No, I don't
quite
think it
different.
is. Yeah, but the idea of reflective equilibrium looks like something that like you can see it being an aspect of the Socratic method, and the
Yeah.
Platonic
I
dialogues.
mean,
And
I think where Rawls probably got it slightly wrong, or just focused on one aspect. I mean, especially with this reflective equilibrium. I think he talks
yeah,
about this elsewhere. But where it's not quite all there is he assumes that there's just one standard,
hmm
that you may have a set of standards that you have, and that they're pretty fixed. And I'm not sure that is quite right. I mean, I also think half the time we really don't even know what our standards are. I mean, I'm very constructivist in this regard.
I was going to ask you, what other advice? Well, we've got you here, and we can kind of pick your brains a bit. Are there any other hints or tips or bits of, despite what you said about, these strategies, maybe any strategies being potentially abused or overused? What other
Right.
advice would you be tempted to give psychotherapists based on the research that you've done?
Oh, interesting. Well, I mean, this will sound very trivial. I mean, this is more of a truism that sometimes it's not about just the dispositions, but the context, and like not underestimate that in a new or also like really consider that unless people change the structure, the system, the context. I
Yeah,
mean, maybe it goes
right.
more into some kind of systemic approaches here.
Yep.
And I don't know how somebody who is practicing classic CBT would even attempt to incorporate that, because there so much is about changing your
You mean
dispositions, your cognitive styles.
you mean the context in which we engage in reasoning might have an effect on?
Well, yeah. So, for instance, sometimes the question is it about changing yourself or changing the world around you? And
Yes.
some of a lot of moments,
Okay.
you just cannot change the world around you. But sometimes you can. Sometimes
Yeah.
you can just move away.
Oh,
Sometimes you can just stop being
sure.
friends with the person who is triggering you.
Uh huh.
Sometimes you
Uh huh.
really need to change the
All
job.
right.
And I think those are important. So there is this great power. I'm a social psychologist by
Yeah.
training, and
Yeah.
in heart, I'm a constructivist. So I think that there's a great
Right.
power of the situation here.
Yes.
So
Well,
that's one.
well, then I'm
With
tempted. Can I respond to that? Because
Yeah, sure, sure, sure.
there's a couple of things that interest me about it, right? So, number one, right, does sitting in a consulting room with a psychotherapist itself constitute a different context?
Yeah.
Because you could say that the very environment that the client is in, in fact, even a very minimal approach to therapy, like client-centered counseling, where the therapist is really just reflecting back what the client says. I mean, one reason that that might be beneficial is the client is talking about their problems, which maybe they do quite a lot outside the consulting room, but they're doing it in a different environment. They're doing it in a different room and to a different person, and with
Yeah.
different kind of expectations and a different context, and a time limit as well, which they maybe don't normally have. Which the time structures things differently. But there's also a technique that we use that I'd like to kind of discuss with you. Um, in cognitive therapy, it's a weird one. It's kind of a behavioral technique, but it addresses our thinking style, I guess. It's called the stimulus control method of managing worry, and it was developed in the 1980s. And it's widely used in the treatment of generalized anxiety disorder or pathological
Mm-hmm.
worrying, basically. But it's also more recently been used to treat clinical depression and a number of other problems, right? And it's a very simple technique. So the instructions given in the initial studies in the 80s were to college students, if you notice, look out for signs that you're beginning to worry. So first of all, spot when you're starting to worry. Number two, write down the thing that you're worrying about in a word or two on a bit of paper, fold it up and stick it in your pocket and set it aside. And then come back to a prescribed time and place. So at 7 o'clock tonight, in my armchair in my living room, I'm going to sit down and think about my
Mm-hmm.
taxes. But I'm not going to allow my thought process to be hijacked while I'm in the middle of doing my groceries, right? So I'm out shopping. I suddenly think, oh man, I haven't filed my taxes yet. And I begin to worry about it. I would
Yeah.
write down the taxes on a bit of paper, fold it up, and say, I'll come back and think about that later at a time of my choosing. Now, there are a number of things going on here, but one of them is that later I'm in a different environment and I'm
Yeah.
controlling that environment more. And so people seem to experience the process of thinking differently and to experience themselves as having more voluntary control over it when they
Yeah.
choose the time and place that they engage in it. And there's obviously a lot of metacognition going on here.
Yeah, quite a bit. I mean, it's also like I'm wondering how's that related to what the current youth is describing as manifesting. I mean, just believe that planning ahead for things to be realized and believing that it has been realized already. I mean, in the background, of course, you start thinking, what exactly do you do to realize things to your liking? Um, I mean, the other thing that I wonder, but I don't think this will, I don't think this will work in a clinical setting. It will freak a lot of people out. But I will still say it.
Say it anyway.
That's,
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
we've still got
So I mean,
brainstorming.
it depends on what kind of clinical population you have.
Yes.
But there's this technique in decision sciences
Yeah.
called post-mortem. I don't
Uh-huh.
know if you ever heard of it. Postmortem is essentially you imagine at the critical juncture where you're sort of making a decision about a particular project at the company, and you're imagining what would happen if this project were to fail,
Mm-hmm.
and what would be the reason for its failure. So it's usually like you're already in the future again, get in a time machine, get into the future. Now it
Uh-huh.
failed, and you're looking back. What were the possible main causes for its failure?
Oh,
Right?
interesting.
And that's a very interesting metacognitive strategy, of course, because it first of all it zooms you out from the immediate
Right.
moment. It opens your mind to alternative possibilities that you probably don't want,
Yeah.
which is why I don't think it'll work in a clinical setting because people are preoccupied with that stuff already.
Exactly. That's the
Uh,
problem there. Yeah, they might be already preoccupied with focusing on the worst case
Right, but
scenarios.
I mean, I think for non-clinical
Yeah.
populations that could be,
Yeah.
when you make real-world decisions,
Yeah.
and they're challenging, this could be one way to approach them because
Well,
often we lock in too early
I
into a particular strategy.
so we could take this kind of um more granular focus where we say, look, there's this way of changing perspective and there's another way of changing perspective. We could go back in time or forward in time or broaden our perspective or adopt someone else's perspective.
Right.
But I wonder if there's a general benefit to just shifting perspective in general. Because one
Yeah.
thing that we notice with clients in therapy, right, that you could say there's like a half a dozen or more like different therapy techniques or self-improvement techniques that involve shifting perspective in this way or that way. But also it's noticeable that clients who are depressed or anxious tend to be locked into a particular perspective quite
Yeah.
rigidly. Like, and anything
Yeah.
almost that changes the perspective in any way will give them more cognitive flexibility, loosen that up, and often,
Yeah.
it does two things, by the way. I would say when people learn to shift perspective, number one, and most noticeably, it tends to reduce the intensity of their anger or depression or whatever. And that's usually what clients notice. But then I think what might be more important is it tends to improve their decision making and problem solving ability, which is maybe going to lead them to behave differently in the situation and benefit them more in the long term. That's my
Yeah.
impression, anyway.
No, I completely agree. I mean, I'm totally on board with, strategies that afford flexibility. My main concern there is more about the measurement of those skills or capacities for flexibility. I find that they are in much of clinical and basic science work, unfortunately misguided because often people are just asked about how flexible they are, and people are very
Right.
bad at reporting that.
Uh-huh.
Because this is stuff that sort of manifests potentially in one situation, and that
Mm-hmm.
may change from one situation to the
Yeah.
next. The whole
Yeah.
definition of flexibility is that it varies,
It's
and
true.
so I'm skeptical whether you can very easily measure that in a self-report fashion, which is exactly
Yeah.
what the majority of clinicians currently do.
Yeah. Okay. That's fair. I mean, I'd be the first to admit that like clinical practice in psychotherapy has many limitations, and many of the things that we do are overly simplistic. I mean, you look at the evolution that's happened in psychotherapy from Sigmund Freud and what he was doing, which people were convinced was a great idea for half a century or more, and how different CBT is to what was done in the past. And there are hundreds of different styles of therapy that people have evolved. And, every proponent of every style of therapy is convinced that it works really well and better than any of the other.
I know.
So
and it's
it's
interesting.
hard to,
Right. And there's money involved, and there is a reputation involved, and everybody thinks that their thing is so different from
everyone
others.
thinks theirs is the best.
Yeah.
And different
I
from
mean,
others.
I had my friend Sindel Segal was here in Waterloo a couple of like half a year ago, and he talks about the mindfulness based therapy, of course. And at the end, I'm like, how's that different from metacognition? He's like, no, it's not. I'm like, okay, it's the same thing. The core is often very similar. It's just the application.
I definitely think there are quite simple processes that are at play in many cases in therapy. Well, clients, usually if you ask the client, I mean, again, you've mentioned that client self-reports aren't all that reliable, but, one thing that's noticeable is the client's understanding of what actually happened in therapy is usually much simpler than the way that therapists conceptualize it.
That's interesting.
Yeah, like if you're working with clients to deal with worry or anger, for example, and you might say, what's the main thing that actually benefited you? And they might say, learning to spot it at an earlier stage is a common thing that they'll say, because if I catch it earlier, it's easier for me to kind of interrupt it or step into a different perspective.
Yeah.
And we might have much more complex ideas about what we're doing, different skills that we're teaching clients and disputing certain beliefs, but for them, it might just be very simple shift in perspective or a very simple skill that they've acquired.
Or developing habits. Actually, the opposite, right? At least on the surface, seemingly the opposite. Developing new habits that they didn't have because they feel like their world is in disarray.
So it's difficult to suggest. We've got some ideas that we can draw from your research that might help.
I hope so.
I wondered if you had. This is going to be. I'm going to ask an even harder question now. I think.
Sure.
Which is, should philosophers be doing philosophy any differently? Because you've given us ideas about the nature of wisdom. Philosophy is meant to be all about wisdom. Should we be doing philosophy differently based on?
Well, I mean, I don't know. How do you do philosophy? Because there's no. I don't think there's a one single way to do philosophy.
But there are stereotypical ways to do it. There are I'll give you an example, right? That might be something you could respond to. Philosophers in ancient Greece used to walk around in a park, surrounded by a group of friends, with some exceptions, but generally speaking, Socrates would talk out in the open with people. Philosophers today obviously go to conferences and seminars and things, but they spend probably most of the time in the basement of the library or whatever. Or in front of a laptop. It's quite an insular pursuit, is what I'm glibly getting at, right? More so than in the ancient world. So, I mean, do you think that wisdom is more easily attained in interaction with other people, like in kind of?
Yeah, I mean, there are two answers to that. Number one, about philosophers in general. Well, I mean, there is a stream of people who, like me, would describe themselves with this term that other philosophers view very negatively, namely experimental philosophers, those who use behavioral or experimental methods to understand human sort of philosophical intuitions instead of just assuming that the baseline for being human is what you come up with in your armchair. So, I mean, some philosophers don't like that. I mean, I think virtue ethicists really can't handle that, or virtue epistemologists, for whatever reason. But others find it quite useful, and I think it's just a natural experimental philosophy in many ways. It's a natural extension of that group of philosophers who were at the beginning of the cognitive science movement, which is kind of interdisciplinary approach to psychology, philosophy, and sort of social sciences. So I think there's some people who use, behavioral methods as an input, and sort of scientific method in general as a way to approach and test their philosophical intuitions and then build them into hopefully more robust models. So that's number one. But I think in general, you're right. I mean, sort of, and this doesn't only apply to philosophers, this applies in general to the question how to think better. And look, as humans are social animals. I think much of our um, capacity for reasoning and engaging in this type of sophisticated metacognitive processes is accentuated when we are surrounded by other people.
Yeah.
So, to very concrete example, there are many papers on this, and I think there was just something recently in Nature about how you need a body to think better, to develop your theoretical understanding better. And
It's
it's
difficult for
true. It
us to
certainly has been
spot our
true.
own biases. Would be one
Yeah,
way
but
of putting
partially
it.
it's
Yeah.
biases, partially it's just about you um, are just better able. You're bringing in different pieces of information, and you can build on each other. And so it's a beautiful thing when you can sort of scaffold on each other new idea, things that you would have never been able to come up with by yourself, cooking in your own sauce, so to say,
Yeah. Yeah.
by having a partner with whom you can sort of build brick by brick, build a theoretical foundation. So I think that sort of like certainly applies to philosophical inquiry, but also to scientific inquiry in general.
Yeah, absolutely. There's one other topic that I wanted to ask you about. Actually,
Okay.
I mentioned like my favorite subject at the moment is anger, and you said that you didn't have as much to say about that, but you might have something to say about intergroup hostility, which is a kind of related topic. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about the relationship between wisdom and intergroup hostility, or maybe I guess conversely cooperation and sort of pro-social
Yeah. Well, I
attitudes.
mean, it's a complex topic. I mean, certainly, if you look in the world, the amount of incivility that we see towards people who think look different, uh, towards people from other countries, and I have hard times reconciling. For instance, I was born in Ukraine. I have relatives in Russia, and that is hard to talk to these days because of everything that's happening in my home country. Um, it's hard to reconcile my beliefs, for instance, in openness and being completely open and willingness to listen to everybody to the same extent, and the knee-jerk reaction of feeling hurt when you hear that you're all Nazis there, and we just need to make you Russian, and everything will be better. So there's a lot to sort of say of intergroup hostility. So on wisdom. So what's interesting is that
Can I
a
just
bunch of
interject an observation about that? So, like in
yeah,
relation to
sure,
what
sure,
you just said, like, so sometimes people say to me, well, why should we empathize with our enemies, for example? Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, that comes up quite a lot in therapy, right?
yeah,
When people
yeah, yeah,
perceive someone as an enemy or an aggressor or as a threat, they naturally don't want to. There was great resistance to empathizing with them. But I suppose another perspective would be that a great general might be somebody who's got a certain amount of understanding of his enemy's motives and their values and the perspective. When we get angry, we tend to have a very simplistic understanding of other people's perspective and motivation. So we just think people acted the way they do because they're malicious or they're an idiot or we
hmm
attribute it to their character as a whole, for example. Rather than in a more nuanced way, to a bunch of motives and assumptions that the other person is making and their values and so on. Therapists have to do that. I mean, any therapist or counsellor is working with a
yeah,
client. They have to develop this much more nuanced understanding of the client's perspective. But I suppose we can help people to motivate themselves to get beyond this sort of reductionist or simplistic understanding and be more open to, for want of a better word, empathic understanding or exploring the other person's perspective by comparing it to a great general or, say, a detective trying to track, like Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty. Like,
Yeah.
a criminal, he has to get inside under Moriarty's skin and put himself in his shoes and try and understand why he's doing the things that he does.
Yeah. So, I mean, at the same time, I mean, Holmes is a good example of somebody who I don't know what I think of in terms of his wisdom-related abilities. Certainly a lot of logic, but not much perspective taking, except what you just described. He had to take perspectives of Moriarty, but I mean, interpersonally, antisocial attitudes of Holmes are very well known, right? So it's like that. It's a complex character. Yeah, I mean, contrasts like the ones that you described against some kind of a negative example may be a way to help. What I was just trying to say is that sometimes it is very hard to reconcile different, even when you have a fairly refined understanding and consideration of different perspectives, it doesn't necessarily make you happier and can necessarily give you a path forward. Sometimes it's much more complex than that. But on a more local level, if you talk about sort of wisdom and antisocial attitudes, so be antisocial versus cooperative behavior, well, we have some evidence that people who are, for instance, more likely to engage in these metacognitive features, recognize limits of their knowledge, consider different viewpoints. You're absolutely right. You could, for instance, use perspective taking to strategically figure out what the other side wants and convince yourself that what they want is to win, and therefore you should be winning more than them. And this kind of zero sum tit for tat type of strategy would be then expanded by perspective taking. And in some experimental work, this is indeed the case. But it turns out that habitually, when people are just asked to play some kind of economic games to see how much do they give or how pro-social they are or anti-social they are, and then at the same time assess their reasoning, either about the game or outside of the game, we often find that there is actually a positive relationship between cooperation and use of this type of metacognitive strategies, like intellectual humility or perspective taking. So overall, humans seem to be doing that. And one explanation could be is because they are, they're considering the long term. They're considering what would be if they were the asshole. And then that sort of like makes them realize, well, maybe that's not the right way to do it in the long term. So like, again, this kind of focus on the big picture here may help reframe a given situation away from, oh, this is just a single interaction, this is anonymous, nobody will find out if I'm an asshole, to something that's kind of, well, if this were to be repeated multiple times and if others were to do the same thing towards me, maybe that would not be a good thing for our sort of community. So that's one thing that we do observe. There's also some evidence, for instance, some of my former students have worked on application of this type of wise reasoning, this type of metacognitive processes in the context of various major societal decisions where there were a lot of hostile intergroup misgivings, be it in Hong Kong, be it after Supreme Court decision in the US about gay marriage early on during the, I think, Obama administration. And what turns out is that, well, at each of those moments, like now, there's very strong feelings towards the out group. And it turns out that, again, those people who are more likely to engage in metacognitive process, they are not viewing the outside group, the one that they don't endorse and normally treat negatively. They are not having strong negative feelings towards them, as compared to those who don't report engaging in this type of metacognitive process. We've seen that, like both some of my students, as I said, during these various social issues around the world. We've also seen that. I have another student who has, together with several colleagues, tracked how you essentially reflect on and explain complex political issues at the peak of presidential elections. And we have done that actually since the last Obama election, like the presidential debates. And that night we would be sampling a large group of people. And then again, Trump versus Clinton. Then again, more recently, did the same thing with Brexit when people are voting for Brexit. And then asked about attitudes towards the outgroup that they don't like, that would vote differently than them, and looked at the relation between metacognition, or the wise reasoning, and intergroup attitudes. And again, we found a negative association between wisdom and intergroup hostility. So there is some evidence that suggests that in everyday life, those two seem to be going hand in hand in such a way that it may seem, I mean, we don't know the exact mechanism, but it may seem that potentially metacognition is at play.
Yeah. Just as an aside, I mean, maybe this is a trivial observation, but in ancient philosophy, and stemming from Socrates in particular, it was believed one of Socrates' slogans is that all the virtues are one, and therefore wisdom and justice he saw as being interconnected, like in some way, or intertwined. I think that's interesting because often we might think of them as, some people in the ancient world thought of them as being completely divorced. The sophists, but some of the sophists are portrayed, at least by Plato, as believing that you could be wise while being kind of cynical about other people and looking down on them, and kind of rejecting the ideal of justice. Yeah. Whereas Socrates saw wisdom and justice as being interrelated in some way. I can't help but ask you this, because I don't know what your views on it might be, or if any of the research that you've been involved with or familiar with relates to it directly. But I think my listeners are typically going to be interested in, because it's a big part of their life now, social media. We spend so much of our time online, and we behave differently, and probably think differently, reason differently when we're on
If we think at all, yes.
Yeah, if we think at all. So, gosh, I'm trying to think of a way to phrase this without it sounding like it's going to sound about ridiculous in a way, but to what extent can someone engage in wise reasoning on, say, Twitter? And is there something about the platform that might inhibit? I'm assuming it doesn't facilitate wise reasoning. It doesn't come across that way. Yeah. What's the interaction between platforms like that and our capacity for wisdom?
I mean, it's an interesting question. Don't know exactly the answer to this question because we haven't done that type of work. I mean, it would be wonderful to do, except that I don't even know what platform to look at now, because it seems like different people oscillate towards different types of echo chambers. And X is definitely not the way to go if you want to have a healthy mental mindset.
One thing I noticed, and maybe this is just kind of anecdotal observation, but I said it in the last conversation that I had earlier today. I don't think I've had many kind of quasi-philosophical discussions with people online. I think I've hardly ever seen anybody change their mind on social media or even admit that they were wrong in their reasoning.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't really promote that. I mean, and that's what I meant earlier when I mentioned that there's an incredible power of the situation sometimes that plays a role. And that, we do seem to flourish metacognitively more in a social context because we have more social cues, because we have more information about other people. If the platform is reducing artificially technical
Cues.
platform is reducing the number of cues to a number of characters to particular formatting, and then algorithms also at play. It's very, very challenging to engage in it more than just like, dislike. And in fact, you can't even dislike, you can just like and then share, um, which activates different types of reward circuits. I don't know if you remember earlier the instant messengers in early 2000s, where there was this ICQ, AOL Messenger, and so on and so forth, right? And if you're on them after a little bit, you get a little bit like the Pavlovian dog, where whenever you get a message, you get this kind of saliva activated, in the sense that you feel good because that's you get somebody wants to talk to you. You got a message, and of course that plays a role, but that has nothing to do with metacognition. And so we have that capacity to be very primitive animals. I mean, primitive.
Yes.
It's a wrong word here, but it's very different type of uh, response based on reward systems and conditioning, essentially.
There's one.
Whereas to activate metacognition, we need
Yes.
more, and we just don't
Right.
have that. I don't see as many platforms, even on
What
Blue
do we need
Sky.
to activate metacognition then? What do just more human interaction, more cues, or is there what other
Yeah,
ingredients are missing from social media that
I mean,
uh,
there are some attempts that technological corporations have tried to implement. For instance, when it was back Twitter instead of X, there was this thing where you could, before you share, or when you try to share something very quickly that you just saw, and they would know that it just popped up for you, so they know that you just saw it. There would be this reminder. Do you want to read this before you share it with somebody? And in some ways, that's kind of like activates metacognition. It's like, are you sure? Maybe you should first
you're
check
right. Yeah,
what
it's
this is
like a
about.
friend saying,
Yeah.
"Hang on a minute." Yeah,
Yeah, and the same thing with Google. I don't know if you remember Gmail. I think still has this feature that you have like 30 seconds to unclick after you
yeah.
send something. So in
I
case
think
you send something really angry or weird, because sometimes you send it and then you read it what you just said,
you
and
realize.
you could reverse that. And I think in some ways it is a technological tool to
Uh huh.
help you with metacognition.
Uh huh.
Um,
Yeah,
at
that
least
makes
in a very
sense.
primitive way.
Yeah,
But of course, that's just a, a bandage
okay.
for something that's much
Banded.
bigger, namely the lack of social context.
Well, okay. So I've got one other can of worms to open before we finish today. You've just kind of
All right.
reminded me of now that we're on the subject of technology, and I'm going to link it to Socrates yet again, right? So Socrates notoriously didn't like books, right? He was concerned about them, although he had I guess like a sort of love hate relationship because he quotes other authors quite a lot. So he must have been reasonably well read, but he
Mm-hmm.
expresses in the Platonic dialogue some concerns about books. And very simply, it's lovely, it's interesting to read this from a modern perspective. He's worried that people who read books are going to become overly dependent on other people to form their opinions in a kind of passive way. So they'll just parrot or regurgitate stuff that they've
Mm-hmm.
read in a
Mm-hmm.
book. And because it hasn't emerged from dialectic or conversation, they don't really
Yeah.
understand. They're just learning to parrot things. So he said, what you get from a book is opinion rather than genuine understanding or knowledge potentially.
Uh-huh.
Right.
Okay.
So he's maybe an overly pessimistic view about books. But the reason I find it intriguing is I think what he says is very similar in some ways to the concerns that people have right now about our increasing dependence on AI, right? So in the same way that Socrates thought
Yeah.
people are going to become very passive and just let books do their thing, let other people do the thinking for them and just repeat what they've read in a book.
Yeah.
The concern now is that we're just going to let AI do our thinking. And, when someone asks you a question, you'll go, hang on a minute, let me just quickly punch that into ChatGPT and then
Yeah.
tell you what it
Yeah.
like. So to delegate reasoning to a device,
Yeah.
basically, what's the impact of AI likely to be on our capacity for wisdom?
Oof, that's a big question. Nobody knows, and everybody kind of freaks out about this. Who's thinking about that? I mean, it can go both ways. On the one hand, um, at least the systems that exist right now demand maybe too much metacognition from you to use them effectively. You know that a lot of people who's like uh, looked at ChatGPT for 5 seconds and realized that ChatGPT is stupid. I mean, that was more like last year than now, but I think there's still some like, oh, I asked it this question and it gave me a really stupid answer. Ha ha! It will never have the capacity to take over human jobs. I'm like, well, that's because you didn't know how to ask the question right. And so it turns
Didn't
out
ask the
ask
right
the question
question.
right, how to do this so-called prompt engineering, at least for systems right now, that probably will pass in the next couple of years, maybe even within a year, where systems are already much better at recognizing what you may actually want from it,
Right.
even if you don't formulate it
Well,
properly. But that
maybe
requires metacognition, right? Sort of like to
maybe
know.
eventually it'll ask the
Yeah,
questions for us. We won't even
yeah.
have to formulate the questions.
Yeah, well, yeah, it will formulate the questions for us. It will answer the questions for us, and it will explain the questions to us, and we are completely out of the loop. Uh, that is also another worry, sort of the other extreme. So on the one hand, there is like concern that there is not enough, and the demand of metacognition in the systems. I actually belong to this group that think that all the discussion about, for instance, AI alignment is misguided. Well, not all of it, but much of it is misguided because humans are not aligned with each other. I mean, we're not even aligned with the UN Charter or human rights guidelines that apparently all societies signed, but nevertheless don't follow or interpret differently. So if humans are not aligned with each other, what does it even mean to align AI? But I think like the issue with humans is that we talked about this reflective equilibrium earlier. That's where we need metacognition because in order to figure out how a particular value that you may endorse fits a particular situation, you need to engage and seriously consider what is the situation about and how much do I know about it and so on. And so yeah, so like building that into AI systems may help us interact with them better and preserve potentially our metacognitive capacities. I mean, at the same time, this is, I mean, I am worried. I'm like everybody, what will happen when, if humans start replacing human partners with a primitive version of AI that just basically endorses everything they say and parrots back to them. Or when, young let's say you think about all this incel kids, young adults who don't know how to interact with the other gender or sex, and then they will all discover beautiful, always willing AI girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever. Like, well, that definitely will not help with the development of metacognitive abilities in their relationship skills. So, what can we do there? How can we intervene? Um, what would be the downstream consequences? At the moment, I don't know. Certainly something to consider. Again, my solution probably would be to figure out how to build in guardrails as well as metacognitive skills into the systems. Um, but again, if we return to this notion of this is a tool, for instance, much of it is about much of wisdom, and that's some of my. I'm just parroting some of what some of my friends said on this topic. There's a lot of wisdom in figuring out when to use the tools and how to use them, and realizing that this is not just an extension of you, and that there's a moment when you should be using it, and there's a moment where you should stop and think by yourself instead of just putting everything in the system. It's remarkable, there, for instance, we do a lot of research in social sciences online these days, and that involves giving people who paid some money surveys to fill out online. Some of the surveys sometimes have open-ended responses just to check what are they thinking about, and also to ensure that they're human. And until AI sort of became this prominent force, that was a very good way to screen for bots. Because you would see them the complex question, and then somebody would answer a very nice study in capital letters. You could just kick that person out, because clearly they didn't answer the question. But now, you could use the chat GPT instead of a simple bot to answer those questions semi-automatically, except that there was some studies that looked into this within the last year. And if I recall it correctly, what sometimes happens, it's not really bots who put in sort of generated answers. It's humans who just don't want to think. Who then
Yeah.
they do the study for £5 potentially, or maybe even less, an hour. I think it's like 10. It's like minimum wage essentially in the UK, and so they have this survey for 20 minutes, and they answer this radio button, so just questionnaire-based type of responses. And then when they get to open-ended question, where they have to actually think and write something, they don't want to think. They would just open a ChatGPT window and copy and paste the question and generate an answer and copy and paste it back into this. This is simpler, even though it actually takes longer probably than to think for a second.
Yeah, thinking is hard.
Thinking is hard. We're cognitive misers in the sense that if you can avoid thinking and just can rely on a few clicks that are mindless, sometimes we do that, and that's danger. Of course, there's a danger in that.
Well, that note of caution about the future and the challenges that we're facing with technology, and the implications it might have for wise reasoning, I think brings us to a natural conclusion in the discussion. I think it's been another great conversation. So thanks for joining me, Dr. Grossmann. And we hope that you listeners enjoyed the conversation as much as we did. Please share the link with your friends and subscribe to the Stoicism Philosophy's Way of Life newsletter on Substack for more podcasts and articles on philosophy. Thanks for listening. It's goodbye from me, Donald Robertson, and from my guest, Igor Grossmann.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay. Bye, everyone.